everyone. Welcome to the first lecture of the 2017 Spring Discover Auburn lecture series. Today is a book talk by John Carvalho. John is in the School of Journalism and Communication. He's an associate professor and the associate director of journalism. And for the sake of not passing off fake news, I'd like to add that John has been received his letter last week notifying him that as of fall semester he will be full professor in the School of Journalism.
I have you to thank for that too, because the book.
John got his undergraduate degree from Auburn University, his master's from Cal State Fullerton, and his PhD at the University of North Carolina. You have that right?
Like McMaster.
All right. Well, while at Auburn, John was on the staff of the Auburn Plainsmen, and after Auburn, he took his career away from Auburn to be a journalist. He returned in 2008, is that correct? 2003, and has been here in the College of Liberal Arts and the School of Journalism and Communication since.
Yep.
When I arranged for this lecture, I thought, well, I don't know much about him. How am I going to find out anything about him? Our reference guy, John, says, oh, I know him. He's got Twitter. He's got a blog. John is a very opinionated person about baseball. So I said, oh, I got to check this out. Our John.
Oh, your John.
Our John Varner. Well, so I checked John's here, and he posts on journalism. He posts on Auburn sports. He posts on sports journalism, and he posts on, or tweets, I guess is what it is, on anything to do with the craft and the politics of journalism and the journalism of politics. So that's John, and his book today is going to be, his talk today is going to be on his book, Frick, a notable and interesting baseball commissioner who began his career in, you guessed it, journalism. Right. Everyone, thank you for coming today and braving the weather, and welcome John.
Thank you. Good deal, yeah. Appreciate y'all being here. We'll have to see how well I do with this stuff. I always tell people, and this is Chaplain Mark Winton from the chapel service, one of the chapel services I volunteer at Fort Benning. And whenever they have any problems with PowerPoints or anything, I tell them, I only have a PhD in this. I don't know how to operate anything. So, but as he said, my book is, it's titled Frick, Baseball's Third Commissioner. And my initial interest in him did arise from the fact that he started as a journalist. And we'll kind of see if I can get this to work. There you go. But what we're going to look at today, and it actually relates to his time as a journalist, we're going to look at what is also chapter 1 of the book. And then we'll do chapter 2, and then chapter. Where in 1961, he ruled that unless Roger Maris broke Babe Ruth's home run record in 154 games, it would reflect he called it a distinguishing mark. Now, he didn't use the term asterisk, even though that was what came to be associated with it. Actually, at the press conference where he announced it, and it turned into a pretty raucous press conference, Dick Young, the columnist for the New York Daily News, said, what are you going to do, put an asterisk on it? And so that stuck, and he got blamed for it. He didn't mind, though, eventually, because he put the word asterisks in the title of his memoirs. But the question is, why would Frick do something like that? And that's what I'm going to talk about. First of all, just briefly about his early life. He was born in Mishawaka, Indiana, a lifelong baseball fan. And he graduated from DePaul University. And as anyone will tell you, you don't say DePaul. I get really mad. It's DePaul University. And when he did, he actually moved to Colorado Springs, Colorado in 1915. He taught high school and college English. You'll see him on the faculty of Colorado College. He wrote for the Colorado Springs Daily Gazette, and he even played semi-pro baseball. It was like his dream to be a baseball player, so he played summers for like 2 summers. Now, what's interesting is, I said he was in Colorado Springs, and actually his big break happened with the Pueblo flood of 1921. But like it says, and I try not to read PowerPoints. I've heard that called PowerPoint karaoke. But there was a flood in Pueblo caused by rain and the failing of 2 dams on the Arkansas River, and totally cut the town off from the north. From the south it was fine, but from the north, from Pueblo north to Colorado Springs and to Denver, there was no way to get there. So what Ford Frick did was he commissioned an airplane to fly over the area and take photos. The pilot sat in front, he sat in back. This is 18 years after the airplane was invented. And he got in an airplane and flew. And what happened was, you can see, I mean, you can see, you really can't see, but he actually took pictures like that of the flood. And yeah, I don't know much about Pueblo, so I can't tell you what is Pueblo and what isn't. But showing how and it was a destructive flood. There were stories about typically when a storm would happen, the residents would rush down to the river because you could actually see it rise and then see it go down. Unfortunately, in this case, when they did that, a lot of them were swept away. They lost their avenue of escape too. But this is an article, like it says, from the June 4th, 1921 front page. And interesting about this is, and notice too, by the way, the article is June 4th. The pictures are June 6th. You know, it wasn't quite the instant stuff we had today. But they did have the stuff because the AP and the Denver Post did try to go down to Denver by car, or go down to Pueblo. They made it, and they couldn't get back. So the Colorado Springs Evening Telegraph, it switched over from the Gazette to the Telegraph, were the only ones who had this. Now, what this meant, though, why this is important, besides the fact that it's a great story, and to think he was on a plane, you know, with brr, 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 you know, was it actually caught the attention of Arthur Brisbane, editor of the New York Journal. The real story of how it happened was that a retired printer had retired to Colorado. They actually had an old printer's home in Colorado where they would retire to. And he sent Frick's stuff to Arthur Brisbane in New York and said, this guy shouldn't just be in Colorado Springs, this guy should be in New York. As a history geek, and Barbara, you're going to love this story. One of the things I did for my research was I was able to visit his grandson. His grandson is Ford Frick II. His father's name is Frederick, and who still lives in Denver. And he was showing me different stuff. They have an original Norman Rockwell that hung in his grandfather's office that they now hang in their living room. And I said, wow, has this been appraised? And he said, low 7 figures. And I was thinking about when I met him, the front door was open. And I called in, and I was like, Ford, and he goes, come on in, I left the door open for you. And I'm thinking, there's $1 million, plus dollar painting, and he's just got the door open. But anyway, And I was going through his stuff, and I had heard different stories about how he came to Brisbane's attention. And as I mentioned in the book, the reason why Barbara and Pam, Barbara Bishop and Pam Whaley, King Whaley, yeah. That's what happens with autocomplete email, is you never learn people's names. Is he didn't leave archives with the Baseball Hall of Fame. But he left some things with his grandson. And so Ford was showing me some different things, and it was fun. And I see this letter, and I said, Ford, this is the letter that the printer wrote to your grandfather telling him that he was going to write to Arthur Brisbane. He was like, oh, okay. And to me, that was like one of the holy grails of this. So Brisbane was the managing editor of New York Journal Hearst's newspaper. And like I said, they met in Steamboat Springs, where Brisbane would vacation, having been made aware of Frick's talents through this printer, offered him a job, and they moved to New York City. So as I mentioned, Ford Frick actually started out as a journalist. That's been one of my interests in my sports media history, is athletes or sports figures who had a media background. I've done writing on Bill Tilden, who was a journalist before he was a tennis champion, and Ford Frick, who started as a new. And the thesis that I always set down is, you know, and especially today, you know, journalists are always criticized. You know, you run your mouths. You always think you're so smart. You know, what if you were in charge? And my answer to that is, do you really want that? Do you really want journalists in charge of things? You know, the only newspaper publisher to be president was Warren Harding. You know, and to become president, he defeated another newspaper publisher, and we saw what happened there. So you know, like Red Smith said after Frick was named president of the National League, you know, well, he offered him all this wonderful advice for free. Why are they paying him for it now? You know, kind of like with journalists. So, so when he went to New York, now New York sports writing in the it was a golden age for New York sports writing. Like I said, we had Grantland Rice, the columnist. To me, ESPN, with its sayings and its overwrought prose that the anchors say, carry on that tradition. We have Damon Runyon, who is actually from Pueblo, so naturally took an interest in Frick and his new career. Now, Frick, however, was not one of the sports writing greats of the time. He was more of a work-a-day kind of guy. In fact, his nickname, he worked so hard, he typed so fast, he filed so many stories, his nickname was Cuthbert. Because the monk, you know, he was like a little monk always huddled over his desk. And it was even to the point where at one of the press boxes, the guys actually told them that was his name, and his placeholder said Cuthbert Frick. And so that was his reputation. He even said, I was never much of a journalist. Now, while he was there, what he did develop was a close relationship with Babe Ruth. And Frick was, like it says, he was his ghostwriter for many years. What they would do back then is they knew that readers would love to see articles by well-known athletes, by the superstars of the time, the Dempseys and the Babe Ruths and all that. But, you know, Babe Ruth was not much of a writer. I mean, he wasn't very reflective, you know. He didn't know people. So Frick would talk to him and then write the articles. In fact, one of the things I'll read to you is about their ghostwriting relationship. According to Frick himself, he began to provide the same service, the ghostwriting for Babe Ruth, soon after he moved with Brisbane to the Journal in 1924. In his own memoirs, reluctant to add fuel to the Marist asterisk fire, Frick only briefly mentions his ghostwriting for Ruth, and then simply to set up an anecdote, where he just says, "Some days later, when I was doing a bit of ghosting, I had occasion to bring up the subject with Babe." The subject, by the way, was whether Ruth had pointed to center field before hitting his home run off Charlie Root in the 1932 World Series. And the outcome of the anecdote was equally noncommittal. You know, Ruth, understanding how good it was to embellish stories, he would never say whether or not he pointed. He would just say, "That's what the newspaper said." So, Frick also referred to his ghostwriting casually in a first-person Sporting News article on his greatest baseball thrill. He said, "I was a busy guy in the Yankee Pirates World Series of 1927. In addition to writing my usual stuff for the New York Journal, I was also ghosting for Babe Ruth, Miller Huggins, and Lou Gehrig. Hug and Babe were regular assignments, but they tossed in Gehrig in that series for good measure." And then it goes on to talk about, oops, no, yeah, that's right there, how he wrote and for Ruth through Christy Walsh, Barbara was instrumental in finding me a pamphlet that Christy Walsh wrote about ghostwriting that helped with this. Walsh estimated that he paid Frick $10,000 during his working relationship with Ruth. Frick was not Ruth's favorite ghostwriter. It was a writer named Bill Slocum. Babe said, "Bill writes more like I do than anyone I know." But the fact that Slocum's and Frick's long and meritorious service to Ruth was no secret either. Thus, it was no huge scoop when Frick candidly told sports writer Jerome Holtzman in a book that came out soon after Frick's memoirs, "I was Babe Ruth's ghostwriter from 1924 until I stopped working in 1934. I think we wrote a schedule of 3 stories a week. I know we did more than one. Lots of times I would talk to him, but there were times when I'd pick up a story and didn't talk to him. But I lived with the old guy, really. Babe was always around, and I was traveling with the ball club, and so there was no excuse not to contact him. I always believed he felt these stories were important, but he never showed much." He was correct. For all of his devotion and hard work for Ruth, Frick was not as appreciated by Ruth as Slocum was. An anecdote from Fred Lieb also confirmed Frick's observation about Ruth's level of appreciation. He recalled a train trip at least 3 years after Frick started ghostwriting for Ruth, when Ruth called out to him, "What's the name of that guy that writes for me? It rhymes with quick or thick." After Lieb reminded him, Ruth said, "That's it. I should have remembered it." So that was kind of what started him in a close relationship with Babe Ruth. Now we're gonna fast forward because from there, like I said, Frick actually became public relations director for the National League in 1934. They were needing the position, and he had shown a good instinct for that, so they named him that. 9 months after that, the president of the National League, John Haidler, retired for health reasons. And so they just named Frick 9 months after becoming public relations director, president of the National League. And he served in that capacity for 17 years until he became commissioner of baseball in 1951. During that time, he successfully turned around several struggling franchises, including the Boston Braves, by getting Ruth to play for them for about 6 weeks. That was all the attention they could get out of him post-Yankees. He did meritorious service for baseball during World War II. Helped not only keep the game alive during that time, but also did a lot in terms of providing baseball equipment to the troops, planning tours as they could happen, with transportation needs being what it was, but would do what he could. So it's not surprising then that in 1948, as Ruth was ill with throat cancer, he wanted Frick to be by his bedside before he died. And I've got that moment as well. Because what happened was actually, first, this is actually from 1948, the ceremony where they retired Ruth's number. And as one of the things that were planned, they wanted Ruth to lead the singing of Auld Lang Syne, which, oh, I know, and he couldn't. He was crying. They actually had 3 tributes to Babe Ruth. April 27th, 1947 was Babe Ruth Day. And Frick spoke, but only as National League president, not as a close friend. Like this says, reading from the inscription of a book the league was presenting to Ruth, Frick said, "To Babe Ruth, whose batting average through the years is exceeded only by the size of his heart, and whose capacity to hit home runs is surpassed only by his capacity to make and hold friends among the people who know him, that you ruined our hopes in many a World Series and too often batted our brains out and made us like it, does not diminish our pride in your accomplishments." So he made another appearance in September 1947, and then this one where his uniform number was actually retired as part of the 25th anniversary of Yankee Stadium observances. And so that was part of the singing of the song, to be that. But he, knowing his health and where things were going, it was very emotional for him. But here's what happened there. By mid-August 1948, Babe Ruth's condition had deteriorated, and he was near death. His condition was a matter of national concern. Even President Truman inquired. One reported visitor was Frick. Ruth's close associate, Paul Carey, had called Frick and told him of Ruth's desire to see him. Frick navigated the 3-ring circus with reporters and photographers waiting. Upon his entrance, the newspaper reported, Ruth greeted him. "Hello, Ford, how are you?" In conversation with Ruth biographer Robert Creamer, Frick recalled, "When I came in, he lifted his eyes toward me and raised his right arm a little, only about 3 or 4 inches off the bed, and then it fell back again. I went over to the bed and I said, 'Paul Carey said you wanted to see me.' And Ruth said in that terrible voice, 'Ford, I always wanted to see you.'" Frick recalled Ruth dying the next day, but the span in newspaper reports between his visit and Ruth's death was actually 3 days. Still, the invitation and recognition were a favored memory for Frick years after, though again, he didn't mention it in his memoirs. But as the media reported and reflected on what would happen in 1961, it was noted not only that Frick was Ruth's ghostwriter, but that he was, in essence, there as Ruth was dying. So it was more than a professional relationship. It was an emotional relationship. Thus, to bring it back to where we started, turn this in the right direction. Thus, in mid-season 1961, and this is what got everybody so frustrated. 1961 was actually the first season with a 162-game schedule. Get this right. The American League had expanded, and the National League would expand the next year. And so to work with 10 teams, they changed in each league. I'm sorry, in the American League, they changed the schedule from 154 games to 162 games. So going into that, if Frick had said something, he might have gotten away with it. Instead, as the 1961 season went on, it became obvious that either Roger Maris or Mickey Mantle was going to break the record. And I don't know. It's one of those things that probably caused a lot of discussion. I don't know that it caused a lot of pain or anything. But for whatever reason, Frick in July announced, because of this, that he would only recognize the record if it was set in 154 games. Believe it or not, at the time, that was a popular decision with a lot of people in the media. They were saying, it's only fair. You don't, in the Olympics, one guy doesn't run 90 meters, another guy runs 100 meters. They both run the same distance. Other people were making the argument, let's keep in mind about Babe Ruth, that when he played in 1927, he didn't have to play against African American players, African American pitchers like Satchel Paige, And so, in essence, he had his own advantage during that time. And the whole thing was that it was mainly ridiculous for how it was handled. But Frick did say that, and that's how it was for years after that. For almost 30 years, both records were shown in the Major League record books. Ruth for 154 games, Maris for 162 games. It wasn't until Fay Vincent, the baseball commissioner in the late 1980s, appointed a committee to deal with it, and they said that they agreed that that would be the record. It's kind of interesting because then in 1962, Maury Wills was coming close to breaking Ty Cobb's season stolen base record. And that was doubly controversial because even though it was a 154-game season, Cobb actually set his record in 156 games. There were 2 rainouts where the records were kept, but the games replayed. That's how they did it back then. And so Cobb had 2 extra games. Maury Wills was angry because he also didn't break the record in 154 games. And by the end of it, what you could tell, by the end of that season, Frick said, you have the record. He had lost his will to deal with that. But in this case, he protected it. And as I was saying, Frick claimed that it was in defense of the integrity of the game. To a lot of people, it seemed like he was mainly obsessed with maintaining Ruth's legacy as well as his record. And to kind of illustrate that, in closing, before I take questions, I'm going to read something from the introduction. Because one of my points is that someone like any baseball commissioner is going to be conservative. He's going to remember the baseball of his youth and what it meant to him and seek to preserve that. With Bud Selig, we see how long it took Selig to accept instant replay to cover close calls, and especially home runs. And the same thing is true about Frick. And so what I say in my introduction is, as commissioner, Frick seemed trapped out of time, even more so as his tenure progressed. He was a newspaper man in a television era. He was an East Coast man in a West Coast era. He was an owner's man in a player's era. He was a train man in a jet airliner era. He was an 8-team league man in an expansion era. He was a 154-game man in a 162-game era. And yes, he was a Babe Ruth man in a Roger Maris era. So I'll stop there, and I'll ask if there are any questions about the life and the work of Ford Frick. Mm-hmm.
When are you able to identify his ghostwriting by his voice, or did he actually
Oh my goodness.
change
Yeah.
it?
No, he didn't try to write like Babe Ruth. You know, you'll read his columns and you'll be like, Ruth doesn't talk like that. You know, he would use turns of the phrase. You know, now and actually I misspoke. Frick mainly wrote for Babe Ruth, like you said, and Miller Huggins, the manager. Walsh, actually, Christy Walsh employed ghostwriters for a lot of people. Not only Ruth and Huggins, but I know he did it for Newt Rockne and Red Grange and other people. So, and yeah, Barbara had found for me this wonderful book where he said adios, it was called Adios to Ghosts. And where he writes about his career, and he just kind of laughs it off. He says, who cares if there's dishonesty? The player's happy, the fan is happy, and the newspaper's happy. You know, if we're all working together this way, what could go wrong? And actually, that really caught our interest. And the way it's evolved is we've actually done we're finishing up a paper, a couple of colleagues in communication and journalism and I, comparing Walsh's approach with the Players Tribune. It's a website that Derek Jeter started where he said, you're going to get this straight from the athletes. And if you read the Players Tribune, they have some good, interesting stuff in there, but there was no mention of an as told to. There's not even a mention of a web producer. And it wasn't until last spring that now you will see the staff of that listed. And so, you know, we're kind of going from the thing about the ethics of ghostwriting in the 1920s, the ethics of Players Tribune now. So, but yeah, you could read that, and Dempsey was another one they used it for, and it was obvious they were using things that they would never say. You know. Yeah, I think it was just him churning out another column and saying and he would also say things like, you know, well, and when they traded so-and-so and brought so-and-so up from the minors and did this and that, and they're going, Ruth doesn't know that, you know, Ruth doesn't know anybody's name, you know, he calls everybody buddy, you know. So, anyway, yeah, they didn't even bother. And that actually, you know, I know that's probably a good distinction with Players Tribune, because I think they do try to maintain that. The contrast that we draw that with is when Sports Illustrated had the exclusive of LeBron's announcement, that he was going to return to Cleveland, they identified the writer who did it, and I believe was it Lee Fitzgerald who did that, and it was very much LeBron's thoughts, LeBron's quotes brought in there. So yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Oh, the athletes got the money. Yeah, yeah. The athletes got more money than the ghostwriters did. Yeah. In fact, Walsh functioned really as Ruth's agent. He not only got him the money, syndicated it, but he managed the money for him. One of the nice things that Walsh did was Babe Ruth never was a case of someone who ran out of money, which he very easily could have been with his personality. Instead, through Walsh's influence, yeah, he was able to. But yeah, the athletes got the majority of the pay for that, even if they didn't. And there's a story in there that I forgot to mention. Let me see if I can find it real quick. I believe this one related to Frick, where yeah. So I'll start this. Writing for a disinterested athlete could be challenging. In 1927, as Ruth was chasing his own home run record, Frick was ghostwriting his daily columns about it. Frick was forced to miss an opening game on a road trip. "Here's what I'd like you to do, Babe," Frick recalled telling him. "As soon as the game is over, write out all the details and telegraph them to me at the office. Then I'll dress it up and stretch it out." The wire came with this information. Quote, "Hit another, period, Babe." On another occasion, according to columnist Bob Wolf of the Milwaukee Journal, it almost caused a different set of problems. Frick predicted on Ruth's behalf that the Philadelphia Athletics would win the 1929 World Series. The problem was that Ruth actually favored the Chicago Cubs. To Frick's relief and Ruth's unearned credit, the Athletics won the series, so Ruth was able to say, hey, just like I said, So yeah, they always had things like that happening.
When did athletes switch from going more from daily articles or weekly periodicals to now it seems like the trend is just to do books, autobiography,
Yeah, well,
as opposed to
what really changed, and we see the seeds of this with Frick, what really started to change was television. Because television meant money. Money brought about the labor movement where the players then fought for more of a share of the money. I always tell my students, we go to watch the players play, we don't go to watch the owners own. So they wanted their share. And so from that, the athletes then began to be more independent of the media. And until where now, journalists today who don't work for ESPN complain that they lack access to the athletes because the athletes don't need them as much as they used to. It used to be they needed that. And so they would curry, and even on into the television age, but once the money really got ridiculous and the endorsements, now they're in control of their own media production. They've got people who will do it for them. They've got Players Tribune. And so, like I said, unless it's ESPN, where they understand that it's in their interest to work with ESPN, they're not as available to the media. Oh, definitely. Yeah. It does provide ethical problems. We've heard of athletes because again, another thing that Frick brought about was really the involvement of media instead of athletes in choosing awards. you know, he's the one who's responsible for sports writers choosing the Hall of Fame, which causes no end of, you know, angst every year. And so that causes, and the most valuable player awards, all those things in baseball are chosen by the media. And that just seamlessly went over into other sports, so a lot of that has changed. And you had cases of where athletes would curry favor with a journalist and offer them access as a quid pro quo that they would then support them for postseason honors. So that puts the journalist in an awkward situation of trading on their integrity for access, you know. So yeah, it's not a very good game to play anyway. So. And in fact, and that was part of the argument there, particularly with Maris, that say what you will about Babe Ruth. It was argued, but and again, you know, like I said, it started out that a lot of the media and the players, although not all, supported Frick, and as time went on, everybody jumped on the bandwagon against him. But early on, that was part of their argument, was that, yeah, when you added 2 extra teams, it didn't automatically increase it overall by, we went out of 8, like 12%. We didn't necessarily have 12% more talented players. It did dilute. And there was the thought that that was what allowed the home runs more than mere skill and the development of athletes. And probably was why they wanted Frick to do something, you know, early on. But the players, by the end of it, were saying, you know, yeah, you could talk this out till you're blue in the face. Let's just, you know, let the records be the records. I got to be honest. When first Mark McGwire and then Barry Bonds broke the record, I believe they broke it plenty of time, you know, so that made the whole point moot. You know, that they broke it before 154 games, obviously, to get those ridiculous numbers that they got at the time, you know, records that now seem a little tainted. Yeah, the asterisk. Yeah, and Sammy Sosa does too. Yeah, that's a separate ethical thing about records that even now, again, the writers are dealing with in terms of denying Bonds the Hall of Fame and McGwire. So, yeah, they don't get into steroids in the book. That's just. That's right. I don't think Frick had much to say about steroids. So. The Ford Frick Award is given to the broadcaster, to the outstanding broadcaster. Because Frick actually, and I didn't really talk about this, later in his writing career became a broadcaster too. He would do, he both did 15-minute sports wrap-ups, and he would help call World Series games. You know, New York was scared to death of radio, and they didn't allow daily broadcasting of games till like 1938 or 1939. They thought nobody would show up if they broadcast the games on the radio, and they were wrong. So Frick was doing that, and was a pretty well-known broadcaster in New York City. He did it for Hearst's radio station. You know, Hearst also owned a radio station. To the point where when he became public relations director, he was allowed to, part of his agreement was that he'd be allowed to continue doing his radio. He also actually hosted a classical music program that Andre Kostelanetz did every week. Frick was the host of that, even though he admitted he didn't know anything. But when he became president of the National League, he had to drop all of that, and he said he actually took a cut in pay to become president because those things were so valuable to him. So in recognition of how he really was something of a pioneer of broadcasting where baseball was concerned. The Ford Frick Award is named after him. So now I don't know how serious it'll be. Now there's a move to replace that and call it the Vin Scully Award because Scully, did what, 60 plus years? Yeah, in fact, when I was doing an article, there was always a National League versus American League writers game in New York. And somewhere around 1951, it mentioned Vincent Scully and being a pitcher. Oh, that name jumps out. So yeah, Scully was there when Frick was there for might even have been there when Happy Chandler was there before Frick. So, but yeah, that's the Ford. It's still called the Ford Frick Award.
Well, thank you for your talk.
Thank you.